She had always moved through the world with a quiet, unshakable confidence, a trait forged in the crucible of events most people couldn't even imagine. Her name was Captain Eva Rostova, and at 34, she was a walking paradox. To the casual observer at the Naval Amphibious Base in Coronado, she was just another fit officer. Her blonde hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, her blue eyes scanning everything with an intensity that was easy to misinterpret as arrogance. But those who knew her, really knew her, understood that the intensity was simply the residue of survival. She was a doctor, a surgeon, but not the kind who worked in a clean, well-lit hospital. Eva was a battlefield surgeon, a ghost who materialized in the smoke and chaos to pull the living back from the brink of death. Her latest assignment was temporary. On a stint as a lecturer at the Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape SEER School. It was a plum posting, a chance to rest, to decompress from the relentless pace of forward deployments. The Navy, in its infinite wisdom, had decided her first-hand experience with severe trauma made her the perfect person to teach medics how to manage their own stress. For Eva, it was purgatory. The classrooms were too quiet, the students too green, and the constant low-level hum of politics was a stark contrast to the brutal honesty of the battlefield. The incident that would redefine her time there began, as many things do in the military, with a physical training assessment. It was a mandatory event, designed to evaluate the baseline fitness of all personnel, from fresh-faced ensigns to grizzled command master chiefs. The morning was cool, a rare gift from the California coast, as Eva made her way to the obstacle course. She moved with a slight stiffness in her left leg, a hitch in her gait that was almost imperceptible unless you were looking for it. Most people didn't. They saw the silver oak leaf on her collar, the crispness of her uniform, and they saw a staff officer, a thinker, not a doer. The course itself was a monument to physical misery. Towering rope climbs, slippery cargo nets, muddy crawl spaces, and a series of walls demanding upper body strength and agility. As the participants gathered, the air crackled with a competitive energy. The instructors, a cadre of supremely fit SEALs and SWCCs, stood apart, their arms crossed, their eyes missing nothing. At their center was Commander Thorne. And he was the stuff of Navy legend, a hulking figure with a shaved head and a jaw that looked like it was carved from granite. He had more combat deployments than most men had birthdays, and he ruled his domain with an iron fist and a voice that could strip paint. He believed in two things: the infallibility of the teams and the weakness of anyone who wasn't in them. Support personnel, officers outside the special warfare community, were, in his estimation, necessary bureaucrats who consumed resources and contributed little. The briefing was short and brutal. The run was to be completed in a set time, followed immediately by the obstacle course. Any deviation from the standard was a failure. As the runners took their marks, Thorne's gaze swept over the group, lingering for a moment on Eva. He'd seen her type before. A doctor, probably promoted for her administrative skills, here to pad her fitness report. He noted the slight stiffness in her stance and filed it away. A weakness. The horn sounded, and the pack surged forward. Eva found her pace, a measured, economical stride that ate up the ground. The first 2 miles were uneventful, a steady rhythm of breath and footfalls. But as the course began to loop back towards the obstacles, a jeep carrying Thorne and his entourage pulled up alongside the runners. He leaned out, clipboard in hand, his eyes fixed on Eva. "Pick it up, Rostova," he barked, his voice amplified by the vehicle's loudspeaker. "You're not on a Sunday stroll. This is a PT test, not a tea party." Eva didn't react. She kept her pace, her focus inward. She knew her body, knew its limits and its capabilities. She was running well within them. Thorne, however, interpreted her silence as defiance, or worse, an admission of inability. I see that hitch in your giddy-up, he continued, his tone dripping with mock concern. What's the matter, Captain? Bum knee from reaching for the top shelf? Or is that the standard excuse from the medical corps? A few of the runners nearby snickered, their own fatigue making them easy prey for the commander's entertainment. Eva still said nothing. She simply rounded a corner and began the ascent up a slight hill, her breathing remaining even. The jeep kept pace. Come on, give me something, Thorne taunted. Spare me the excuses. The enemy isn't going to wait for you to get your second wind if you can't handle this. What are you even doing here? The question hung in the air. It was the question she had been asking herself for weeks. What was she doing here? In this sterile environment, when her skills were needed where the air was thick with dust and the coppery smell of blood? She pushed the thought away and focused on the course, which had now come into view. The jeep sped ahead, parking near the finish line, so Thorne could have a front-row seat for her humiliation on the obstacles. By the time Eva reached the course, her time for the run was solid, if not spectacular. The other participants were already attacking the obstacles, their movements fueled by adrenaline and the desire to impress. Thorne stood with his stopwatch, his gaze fixed on her. The first obstacle was a 6-foot wall. Eva approached it, planted her right foot, and launched herself upwards, grabbing the top. As she swung her left leg over, a bolt of white-hot pain shot through her hip and down her thigh. It was a familiar pain, an old friend she had learned to live with. She landed on the other side, absorbing the shock through her right leg, and moved on. She was slower on the obstacles than the others. That was undeniable. The rope climb was a study in controlled agony, her arms doing most of the work, her legs dangling uselessly. The cargo net, which required a scrambling, four-limbed ascent, was particularly brutal. By the time she reached the low crawl under the barbed wire, sweat was pouring down her face, and the hitch in her gait was a pronounced limp. Thorne saw his opening. As she emerged from the wire, covered in sand and dust, he walked over, his expression one of theatrical disbelief. He shook his head slowly, a smirk playing on his lips, and he made sure his voice carried to the knot of instructors and sailors who had gathered to watch. Well, that was something, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Care to explain that performance, Captain? Because from where I'm standing, it looked like you were mailing it in. That's not the standard here. Not even close. He gestured with his clipboard. I'm sure you've got a story. A pulled hamstring? A blister? He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone that was still perfectly audible. Spare me the excuses. In my world, you either perform or you get out of the way, so which is it? Eva stood there, breathing heavily, her face flushed with exertion. The sand clung to her damp skin. She looked at Thorne, this man who commanded respect through fear and physical prowess, who saw the world in black and white. As she saw the eager faces of the young sailors, waiting for the staff officer to crumble, to offer some pathetic justification that Thorne would then tear apart. She had a choice. She could walk away, let the moment pass, and endure his silent contempt for the rest of her tour. Or she could answer. She didn't say a word. Instead, she reached down with her right hand and grasped the hem of her moisture-wicking shirt. In one fluid motion, she pulled it up and over her head, standing before them all in her regulation sports bra. For a moment, there was only confusion. Thorne's smirk faltered. Then, as the sailors' eyes adjusted to what they were seeing, a collective sharp intake of breath replaced the silence. Eva's torso was a roadmap of survival. It was not the unmarred physique of a fitness model. It was the canvas of a warrior. As across her ribs on her left side was a thick, ropey scar. the legacy of a surgeon's scalpel from an emergency operation in the field. But it was her left hip and thigh that commanded attention. The skin there was a chaotic tapestry of healed tissue. A large, discolored patch, roughly the size of a dinner plate, was pitted and puckered. A constellation of smaller, circular scars surrounding a central, more violent wound. It looked like what it was: the aftermath of an explosion. Shrapnel. Hundreds of tiny, red-hot pieces of metal had torn into her flesh, shredding muscle and chipping bone. The surgeons had done their best, but they couldn't erase the damage. They could only save the limb and the life attached to it. The silence was absolute. The only sound was the distant crash of the Pacific Ocean and the soft whisper of the wind. Thorne's smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of stark, unadulterated shock. His face, moments ago a mask of arrogant certainty, was now pale. He stared at the wound, his mind racing to comprehend it. This wasn't a training accident. This wasn't a sports injury. This was the signature of war. Eva held his gaze, her own blue eyes as cold and hard as the metal that had once torn through her. She slowly turned, giving the entire assembly a clear, unimpeded view of the damage. She wanted them to see. She wanted them to understand. Then, just as slowly, she pulled her shirt back down, tucking it into her shorts. She picked up her water bottle, took a long, deliberate drink, and without another word, turned and walked away from the obstacle course. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. See, the silence she left in her wake was louder than any excuse Thorne could have demanded. The silence that followed Ava's departure was a physical weight, pressing down on everyone present. Commander Thorne stood rooted to the spot, his stopwatch dangling uselessly from his fingers. The jeering confidence that had been his armor was gone, shattered by the sight of a truth he had been too blind to see. The young sailors who had been on the verge of snickering now looked at their boots, a hot flush of shame creeping up their necks. They had been complicit, their silent amusement at the captain's expense now a source of deep embarrassment. For a long, painful moment, no one moved. Then, the senior enlisted advisor for the command, a master chief named O'Malley who had seen more than his fair share of combat, let out a low, slow whistle. And he looked at Thorne, his expression unreadable. "Well, Skipper," he said, his voice quiet, but cutting through the quiet like a knife. "I think you got your explanation." Thorne flinched as if he'd been struck. He opened his mouth to speak, to maybe issue an order, to restore some semblance of control. But no words came. He simply turned and walked towards his jeep, his massive frame seeming somehow diminished. He didn't watch the rest of the PT test. He just sat in the vehicle, staring straight ahead, his mind a chaotic storm of images. His own smug face, the mocking tone of his voice, and then that horrific, beautiful, undeniable map of survival on Eva's skin. Back at the headquarters building, the news traveled with the speed of light. It wasn't gossip, not really. It was the silent, a respectful transmission of a truth that had been witnessed. By the time Ava had showered and changed into her service khakis, the atmosphere in the hallways had shifted. People who had previously offered only curt nods now met her eyes with a new respect, a quiet acknowledgement. They didn't know the full story, but they knew enough. They knew she carried a piece of the war inside her. Eva retreated to her small Spartan office. She sat at her desk, not working, just staring at the wall. She hadn't planned to reveal her scars. It had been a moment of pure, unadulterated fury. Thorne's arrogance, his casual cruelty, had triggered something deep within her. It was the same fury she felt when she saw a preventable wound, a death caused by stupidity or negligence. She had reacted on instinct, and using the only tool at her disposal to silence him. But now, in the quiet aftermath, the familiar ache in her hip throbbed a dull reminder, and with it came the